Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Before I begin, I would just like to ask that when the vote be taken on this amendment, that it be taken by roll call.
Question is roll call vote on the amendment. Let me try your minds. All those in favor of a roll call vote, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Necessary 20% has been met. When the vote is taken, it will be taken by roll.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 4 years ago, when I first started my time here in the state legislature, we were facing a massive budget deficit, one that was built up for many years, passed by this body for many years, kicked the can down the road. 4 years ago, we were told that the largest tax increase in state history would solve that problem. We were told if we passed the largest tax increase in state history, that our economy would turn around, that our state would be facing greener pastures, that we would be in much better position 4 years ahead. Well, here we are, just about 6 o'clock in the morning, June 3rd, last day of session. And what are we facing? We are facing the second largest tax increase in state history. We are facing massive spending increases to the tune of $713 million. And what is possibly most offensive to our constituents is that we are blowing straight through our spending cap that so many people ask for us to put on ourselves. And to the tune of billions of dollars being moved out from underneath that spending cap in the out years. Now, many of our constituents are waking up this morning. They are likely heading to work. It's a Wednesday. Unfortunately, we just heard yesterday that 180 employees at one of our largest employers in the state in Sikorsky are going to be receiving their pink slip either yesterday before they left or most likely this morning when they show up to work. And why is that? Because of the business culture that we have created here in the state of Connecticut by passing bills like this budget that we're doing right now. 180 people are losing their jobs in the state of Connecticut in one of our largest employers. Now, that's just what's in the news. What we don't know about is all those small businesses that are laying somebody off here in the state of Connecticut this morning. What we don't know about is all those families that are now searching for a way to pay their bills because of the decisions that we're making right here in this chamber right now at 6 o'clock in the morning on the last day of session. Those are the decisions that we're making right now, everybody. Those are the decisions that are going to set the path for the future of the state of Connecticut, and we're doing it right now at 6 o'clock in the morning on the last day of session. We heard from many of our largest employers in this last week, GE, Aetna, Travelers, Boehringer Ingelheim. I've personally heard from many other ones that privately told me this budget is absolutely terrible. But you know what possibly is one of the most interesting headlines that I saw in these last few days once we were finally made aware of what was actually in this budget, or potentially in this budget? The Hartford Courant had a headline, "The state budget is an attack on the modern economy." That's what the Hartford Courant article said. An attack on our modern economy rests within this state budget that we will take a vote on shortly. Is that truly what we want to do? When our constituents are waking up now, thinking about heading to work, and asking, what in the world are they doing? What in the world are they doing in Hartford right now? They're making it harder for me to make a living. They're making it harder for me to save for my kids' education. They're making it harder for me to save for my retirement. They're making it harder for me to live here in the state of Connecticut. And that's the decision that we're making here this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, this budget does not set us on a brighter path. It sets us backwards, and unfortunately is setting us down a path that will most likely lead us to a much worse future than what we have here today. And through you, Mr. Speaker, I have a series of questions for the kind chairman of the Finance Committee, if I may.
Please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through you to the chairman of the committee, I see that we are reducing the property tax credit on families here in the state of Connecticut from $300 to $200 in fiscal year 17. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger?
That is correct.
Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And through you, did that proposal receive a public hearing?
Representative Berger?
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I believe it did.
Representative Davis?
Through you, Mr. Speaker, would the kind chairman of the Finance Committee please tell me which date that public hearing was held on? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger?
I do not have that date available at this time.
Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, because I don't think that date exists. I see that we are reducing the threshold for those filers in order to qualify for this exemption. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger?
That is correct, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we're doing right there is a $125 million tax increase on the middle class and the working class here in the state of Connecticut. That is what we're doing by lowering that property tax credit and lowering those thresholds. Mr. Speaker, I see that we are delaying the increase in the personal exemption for single filers for 1 year in 2016. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger?
That is correct.
Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is a $10.8 million tax increase on single filers. Young people trying to make a living, seniors who are single filing their taxes that still make a little bit of money because maybe they're able to have Social Security, maybe they have some income still coming in. That's a $10.8 million tax increase on those individuals here in the state of Connecticut. Mr. Speaker, I see that we're attempting to reduce the per-item exemption for the sales tax holiday from $300 to $100. Is that correct through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Berger?
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct.
Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is a $1 million tax increase on the middle class here in the state of Connecticut. Mr. Speaker, I see that we are repealing the exemption on clothing and footwear for the sales tax. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger?
That is correct, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is a massive tax increase on our middle class and our working class here in the state of Connecticut because that's the exemption on clothing and footwear under $50, the ones that are most commonly bought by our constituents. We're looking at raising their taxes, making them pay the sales tax to the tune of $136.8 million in 2016 and $142.6 million in year 17. Through you, Mr. Speaker, I see that we are increasing the state's luxury tax on sales from 7% to 7.75%. Is that correct, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Berger?
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct.
Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And oftentimes we think of this luxury tax that was implemented 4 years ago, and someone maybe buying a Maserati or buying a nice Rolex watch. But it's also the girl that works at Paul's Pizza, maybe making $10, $11 an hour if you include her tips, working her tail off, trying to get as much money as she possibly can because she's getting married. You know what she would like to do? She would like to buy a wedding dress here in the state of Connecticut so that she can get married. And you know what she's going to have to do now? She's going to have to pay higher taxes because we're passing this luxury tax. If she goes down to David's Bridal and tries to buy a wedding dress for more than $1,000, boom, we're hitting her up for a higher tax, everybody, because we think the state of Connecticut deserves that money more than she does. Mr. Speaker, did that luxury tax increase receive a public hearing? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger?
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. I was somewhat distracted here. Could the representative please repeat the question?
Representative Davis, could you repeat your question?
Most certainly, Mr. Speaker. Through you, Mr. Speaker, did the luxury tax increase receive a public hearing?
Representative Berger?
I don't believe it received a public hearing this year, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see that we're also increasing the rate on computer and data processing services to 2% in fiscal year 16 and 3% in fiscal year 17. Is that correct, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Berger?
That is correct.
Representative Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is a tax increase on our businesses here in the state of Connecticut, both small and large, to the tune of $39.9 million in fiscal year 16 and $83.1 million in fiscal year 17. Mr. Speaker, did that receive a public hearing this year? Through you.
Representative Berger?
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I don't have the exact date of that public hearing.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that's because that public hearing did not take place. Through you, Mr. Speaker, I see that we are raising the tax on the World Wide Web services from 2% to 3%. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
That is correct.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is yet another tax on our businesses here in the state of Connecticut to the tune of $15.5 million and $32.4 million in fiscal year 17. Through you, Mr. Speaker, did that tax increase receive a public hearing?
Representative Berger.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have available the date and time of that exact public hearing. Through you.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, because I do not believe that public hearing took place. Mr. Speaker, I see that we are amending alcohol policies in the state of Connecticut to extend the hours at liquor stores and to increase the franchise permits. Through you, Mr. Speaker, how much revenue is that intended to receive here in the state of Connecticut?
Representative Berger.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, we add growlers to that also, and the estimated revenue obtained is $2.1 million in each year of the biennium. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I see that we are also repealing the exemption for water companies to make purchases, and now they will be paying a 6.35% sales tax. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Mr. Speaker, that would be for non-municipally owned water companies. Through you, as a clarification.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that clarification. Did that tax increase receive a public hearing? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do not have the exact date and time of that public hearing. Through you.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, because that also did not receive a public hearing. And that is a cost that is almost most certainly going to be passed down to us, the consumers. Through you, Mr. Speaker, I see that we're removing the exemption for car wash sales. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
That is correct, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And did that receive a public hearing? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I do not have available the time and date of that exact public hearing. Through you.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that's because that also did not receive a public hearing. Through you, Mr. Speaker, I see that we are eliminating the fiscal year 17 deposit of the Regional Performance Incentive Account diversion. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Berger.
That is correct, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To be clear, that is when our hospital or our hotel tax and our rental car taxes are deposited into an account that is supposed to be used for regional incentivizing for our municipalities, supposed to be used for property tax relief, ways for them to save money. We are eliminating that under this budget, and we're just putting $10 million into the general fund because the state of Connecticut thinks that we need that $10 million in the general fund rather than property tax relief. Through you, Mr. Speaker, I see that we are repealing the exemption on motor vehicles parking, long-term parking, and now charging the 6.35% sales tax. Is that correct, Mr. Speaker? Or Madam Speaker at this point?
Representative Berger.
That is correct.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And did that receive a public hearing?
Representative Berger.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I do not have the exact date and time of that public hearing.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, because that public hearing also did not take place. I see that we are establishing a mandatory combined reporting for our businesses here in the state, most specifically those who are headquartered here. Through you, Madam Speaker, could you tell us how much of a tax increase that is on our businesses in fiscal year 16 and fiscal year 17? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, Madam Speaker, through you. The estimated revenue in 2016 would be $38.6 million, and estimated revenue in 2017 of the biennium would be $23.7 million. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And did that tax increase receive a public hearing? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, Madam Speaker, through you. I do not have the exact date and time of that public hearing on that particular event.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, because I believe that public hearing never took place this session. Madam Speaker, I see that we are extending the surcharge on corporations' income taxes. Through you, Madam Speaker, can the kind gentleman please describe the tax increase that is taking place on businesses in 2016 and 2017 in that line item? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Berger.
I'm sorry, Madam Sir. What was the line item on? Was that on the surcharge?
Representative Davis.
Yes, Madam Speaker. I see that we are extending the surcharge on the corporate income tax.
Yes, through you, Madam Speaker. That is a 20% surcharge that currently was in place that we are also extending through the biennium. It is the desire of the committee in 2018 to slowly wean ourselves off that and reduce that from 10 to 0. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And that is a 44.4% tax increase in our employers, those that employ us and employ our constituents, a $44.4 million tax increase in fiscal year 16 and a $75 million tax increase in fiscal year 17. Madam Speaker, I see that we are reducing the use of credits against certain taxes for businesses here in the state of Connecticut. Through you, Madam Speaker, would the kind Chairman please describe the impact of that line item tax increase in fiscal year 16 and fiscal year 17? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I certainly will. As I think in my opening statements, that was a tax that was originally stepped down to 35%, then 45%, then capped out at 60% from an original proposal. That is currently established at a set percentage of 50.01. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And that is a tax increase of 42.5%, or $32.5 million in fiscal year 16 and $34 million in fiscal year 17 on the people that employ our constituents here in the state of Connecticut. Through you, Madam Speaker, I see that we are restricting net operating loss carry-forwards by the use of corporations. Through you, Madam Speaker, would the kind gentleman please describe the tax increase in fiscal year 16 and the amount of the tax increase in fiscal year 17? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, Madam Speaker. Those figures are derived through a reduction from 100% to 50% for the NOI loss carry forward. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. That is a very interesting tax increase that we have proposed here before us, because that tax increase specifically targets those companies that have net losses. Those companies are oftentimes our small businesses that file as corporations. Those companies are ones that oftentimes are ones that are just starting out, incurring those costs, trying to create jobs here in the state of Connecticut. And instead of, reducing spending or trying to do other things, we're saying we want to take $156.3 million in fiscal year 16 and $90.1 million in fiscal year 17 from the employers that employ our constituents here in the state of Connecticut. Through you, Madam Speaker, I see that we are increasing the tax on cigarettes here in the state of Connecticut to the tune of 25 cents in fiscal year 16 and 50 cents in fiscal year 17. Is that correct? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Through you, Madam Speaker, that is correct.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And whether or not you agree with smoking or the use of cigarettes, it is a $21.7 million tax increase in our constituents in fiscal year 16 and a $40 million tax increase in our constituents in fiscal year 17. Through you, Madam Speaker, did that tax increase receive a public hearing?
Representative Berger.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I do not have the exact date and time of that public hearing related to that specific event.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and that's because I believe that public hearing did not take place this session. Through you, Madam Speaker, I see that we are updating the hospital net revenue tax. Through you, Madam Speaker, are we raising taxes on hospitals by $160.5 million in fiscal year 16 and $160.5 million in fiscal year 17? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Madam Speaker. That is not the total amount. The hospitals will actually have some federal gain back to them. That is the amount minus the federal give back to the hospitals that will be retained by the state of Connecticut. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and that's interesting because I believe that means we're actually taxing them even more, and this just happens to be the share that we get to keep as the state of Connecticut to use as we see fit in our general fund. Through you, Madam Speaker, I see that we're also increasing the hospital tax rate to 6%. Through you, Madam Speaker, did that tax increase receive a public hearing?
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Madam Speaker, I do not have the exact time and date of that public hearing as it relates to that particular event.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and that's because that public hearing also did not take place this session. And that's a tax increase on our hospitals to the tune of $46.5 million in fiscal year 16 and $46.5 million in fiscal year 17. Through you, Madam Speaker, I see that we're attempting to place a new tax on ambulatory surgical centers at the tune of 6% on their gross receipts. Is that correct? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Berger.
That is correct, Madam Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And did that tax increase receive a public hearing?
Representative Berger.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I do not have the exact date and time as it relates to that particular event. Through you.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's because I believe that public hearing also never took place this session. But that is a $15 million tax increase on our ambulatory surgical centers in 16 and a $20 million tax increase in 2017. And what's interesting about that tax is that it's on their gross receipts. So what they'll do is they'll just pass that on to the consumer. And then it will actually be double taxation because they'll be passing that on to the consumer and then paying the tax when that takes place as well. So the state of Connecticut will probably make even more money off of that change in policy. Through you, Madam Speaker, I see that we are adjusting reimbursement rates for Resident State Troopers program, and we're now requiring our small towns that take advantage of this program to pay 85% of the cost. Is that correct? Through you, Madam Speaker?
Representative Berger.
Yes, Madam Speaker, that is correct, and it's hopeful that the incentives that we do in SB 1 that will take effect in 2017 will help alleviate that expense. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And that is a tax increase, potentially property tax increase that's going to be necessary, and or a services decrease by our towns to the tune of $2.5 million in fiscal year 16 and $2.5 million in fiscal year 17. That impacts so many of our small towns. Madam Speaker, I see that we are authorizing Keno. Through you, Madam Speaker, does the authorization of Keno require a agreement with the Native American tribes in the state of Connecticut? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Through you, Madam Speaker, it does. And those negotiations, as the good representative is aware, were conducted several years ago when Keno was authorized by this legislature. And those will have to be, as the representative alluded to, would have to be signed and documented and percentage determined. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I see that in fiscal year 16, we are raising $13.6 million in Keno revenue. In fiscal year 17, $30 million. Although we don't have an agreement with the tribe signed yet, we don't really know if we're actually ever going to receive that money because 2 years ago, we did the same exact thing. We passed this Keno expansion, but in fact, we never actually had Keno put into the state of Connecticut, and we had to come up with about $50 million that we had built into the budget. Through you, Madam Speaker, I see that we are dedicating sales tax funds to the Special Transportation Fund, but then we're also not making the statutory deposit into that Special Transportation Fund. So in fiscal year 16, it's actually a net of only about $6 million. Is that correct? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Berger.
Yes, through you, Madam Speaker. It was determined through a policy decision that the ramp up of SB 1 through transportation would allow for an additional slower ramp up through 16 and 17, but considerable ramp up in the out years. Through you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So make no mistake about it. We're being told that we are going to divert money from the sales tax into a special transportation fund to pay for transportation projects. But in fact, we're not really putting very much money into that special transportation fund because we're not diverting the money that's supposed to go there already. So we're basically just having the same amount of revenue go into that account as we originally would have anyway. I would like to thank the kind chairman for his answers, Madam Speaker. When we went through the election just a few months ago, we were told by both of our gubernatorial candidates that we would have no new taxes, that no taxes would be put on the people of the state of Connecticut, that would just be too much, we couldn't handle it, our economy is too fragile. But look at where we are today. Now it's about 6:10 in the morning on the final day of session, and we're about to raise taxes to the tune of almost $2 billion in new revenue over the next 2 years. These taxes are not only on going forward, but they're also retroactive. A number of these corporate taxes, a number of these personal income tax increases, they go back. They go back to January. We are raising taxes on people retroactively. And we were told by many people that that is not a good policy decision. What's also most troubling is that the OFA analysis on this budget does not take into account the potential job losses, the potential that businesses may move out of our state, and that these revenues actually may not actually be met, and our budget will be out of balance. And we could say, oh, that's just speculation, but look at where we are today. We're $200 million in the hole from a budget that we passed 2 years ago and updated only a year ago, and we're still $200 million in the hole because what we attempted to do then by raising so much revenue didn't come through because so many people were leaving our state, so many businesses were closing, so many people were losing their jobs. My fear is that we will be right back here in just a few months trying to determine how we're going to close the deficit because these revenue numbers will not come to fruition. I also find it very ironic that we're putting a spending cap on our towns in this budget. We're saying you can't spend more than 2.5% when you receive money from the state of Connecticut, when in fact we're blowing straight through our own spending cap here. We're blowing right through our own spending cap. We're changing the rules as the game's being played, and we're saying that that spending cap no longer means anything, but we're going to put that spending cap on our towns. Do we truly believe that the state will keep its promise when it comes to giving this money to our towns? Do we truly believe that? Just 4 years ago, we created a scheme very similar to this one. We said we're going to take a portion of the sales tax, we're going to put it in an account, and then we're going to redistribute that back to the towns. Well, guess what happened? About a year later, we said, oh, no, we need the money. Let's keep it in our pockets. Sorry, towns, you don't get that money. Do we really think that we're going to be able to do this in the out years as described by the kind chairman from the Finance Committee? I don't believe so. And let's be honest with ourselves, I don't think we're going to be able to do it in the Special Transportation Fund either, because most likely we're going to need that money very quickly. So what are we doing here? We're balancing our budget on a huge tax increase. We're doing it on unsubstantiated gambling revenue because we don't have an agreement in place. We've got to go back to our Native American tribes and ask them for their assistance. We don't know how much money they're going to ask for in return. And then we're also saying we want to balance our state budget on people drinking for longer hours at night. We're saying we want to balance our state budget by people going to the package store for an extra hour. Is that really what we want to do here in the state of Connecticut? Is that the kind of state of Connecticut that we want to live in, that I, with a 3-month-old daughter, want to raise here in the state of Connecticut? I quite frankly think we can do a lot better, and I believe the people of Connecticut deserve much better. Thank you, Madam Speaker.